the perfectionist who could never forgive himself. Paul Newman's secret. Battle with guilt and obsession, January 15th, 1978. Paul Newman stood in his garage at 3 a.m., obsessively rebuilding the same race car engine for the fourth time that week. His hands were bleeding from the metal edges, his marriage was crumbling, and his 28-year-old son, Scott, was spiraling into a drug addiction that would kill him within 6 months. But Paul couldn't stop working. The need to control something, anything, to make something perfect when everything else was falling apart, had become his prison. What nobody understood was that America's most beloved leading man was slowly destroying himself and everyone he loved with an obsession for perfection that had started as strength and become a curse. This is the Paul Newman story that destroys the perfect image. Not the charming rogue from Butch Cassidy or the devoted husband from magazine covers. This is about the man who could never live up to his own impossible standards, whose perfectionism became a weapon he used against himself and his family. This is about how America's golden boy spent 50 years trying to earn a forgiveness that would never come, because the person he needed it from was himself. Because Paul Newman wasn't just a movie star. He was a man trapped in a prison of his own making. Every success felt like a failure. Every compliment felt like a lie. And every mistake became evidence that he was the fraud he'd always believed himself to be. The perfectionism that made Paul Newman a star began as a desperate need to prove he wasn't worthless. Paul Leonard Newman was born in 1925 in Shaker Heights, Ohio, to Arthur Newman, who owned a successful sporting goods store, and Teresa Fetzko Newman, a practicing Christian Scientist. From the outside, it looked like a perfect middle-class family. From the inside, it was a pressure cooker of expectations and impossible standards. Arthur Newman was a demanding father who believed that anything worth doing was worth doing perfectly. He never praised Paul's accomplishments, only pointed out what could be improved. When young Paul brought home A's, Arthur asked why they weren't a plus. When Paul excelled at sports, Arthur focused on the games where he hadn't been the star. "Nothing I did was ever good enough for my father," Paul later told his therapist. "And eventually, I started believing that nothing I did was good enough." Period. The pressure was intensified by Paul's younger brother, Arthur Jr., who seemed to effortlessly meet their father's expectations. Arthur Jr. was the academic star, the responsible son, the one who would take over the family business. Paul was the disappointment, good-looking but unfocused, talented but undisciplined, charming but unreliable. The event that would haunt Paul his entire life happened when he was 17 years old. In 1943, Paul was supposed to drive his brother Arthur Jr. to a job interview at a defense plant. But Paul had been out late the night before and overslept. Arthur Jr., always responsible, decided to take the bus instead rather than be late for his interview. The bus crashed. Arthur Jr. was killed instantly. Paul Newman never forgave himself for his brother's death. If he had been responsible, if he had woken up on time, if he had been the brother Arthur Jr. deserved, his brother would still be alive. The guilt became the defining fact of Paul's existence, the wound that never healed, the debt that could never be paid. "I killed my brother," Paul told his wife Joanne Woodward decades later. "Not directly, but my selfishness, my irresponsibility, that's what killed him. And every day since then, I've been trying to make up for it." Paul's entry into acting was motivated by guilt, not ambition. After serving in the Navy during World War II, Paul tried to take over the family sporting goods business, feeling obligated to fulfill the role Arthur Jr. should have had. But Paul was miserable in business and terrible at it. He was creative, emotional, and restless, everything his father despised in a businessman. When Paul finally admitted he couldn't continue in business and wanted to try acting, Arthur Sr. was devastated. "You're abandoning your family, your responsibilities," he told Paul. Arthur would never have done this. The accusation hit Paul like a physical blow. His father was right. Arthur Jr. would never have abandoned the family business for something as frivolous as acting. But Paul also knew he would destroy himself if he stayed. So he made a deal with his conscience. He would become the greatest actor he could be, not for fame or fortune, but as penance for his failures as a son and brother. Paul's perfectionism in acting became legendary and destructive. When Paul arrived in New York in the early 1950s to study at the Actors Studio, his intensity immediately set him apart. While other actors saw method acting as a technique, Paul saw it as a form of self-punishment. He pushed himself to emotional extremes, lived inside his characters until the lines between Paul Newman and his roles blurred. Director Elia Kazan, who worked with Paul early in his career, was both impressed and concerned by Paul's approach. "Paul didn't just play characters," Kazan said. "He seemed to disappear into them completely. It was brilliant, but it was also dangerous. He was using acting to hurt himself in ways that weren't healthy." Paul's breakthrough came with Somebody Up There Likes Me in 1956, where he played boxer Rocky Graziano. Paul prepared for the role with typical obsessiveness. He trained with actual boxers until his face was constantly bruised, studied Graziano's movements until he could mimic them perfectly, and lived in character for months. The performance made Paul a star, but it also established a pattern that would define his career. Paul Newman didn't just act in movies. He disappeared into them so completely that coming back to himself afterward was always painful. Paul's marriage to actress Jacqueline Vitta was doomed by his inability to believe he deserved happiness. Paul married Jackie in 1949, when he was still struggling as an unknown actor. Jackie was beautiful, supportive, and completely devoted to Paul. She gave up her own acting career to support his dreams and raise their 3 children, Scott, Susan, and Stephanie. But Paul couldn't accept Jackie's love because he didn't believe he deserved it. Every kindness she showed him felt like proof that she didn't really know him. If she knew the real Paul, the selfish brother, the failed son, the fraud who was pretending to be an actor, she would leave. Paul's paranoia became self-fulfilling prophecy. He worked constantly, partly to prove himself and partly to avoid intimacy that felt threatening. He had affairs, not because he didn't love Jackie, but because he believed that if he pushed her away first, the inevitable abandonment would hurt less. "I sabotaged that marriage from day one," Paul later admitted. Jackie deserved better than a man who couldn't believe in his own worth. But I couldn't stop myself from proving that I was the disappointment everyone knew I was. Everything changed when Paul met Joanne Woodward in 1953. Joanne was everything. Jackie wasn't independent, strong-willed, and completely unimpressed by Paul's movie star persona. She saw through his charm to the wounded man underneath, and instead of being repelled by his damage, she was intrigued by it. "Joanne understood my darkness," Paul said. "She didn't try to fix me or save me. She just accepted that I was complicated and decided to love me anyway." But Paul's love for Joanne created a new kind of torture. He was still married to Jackie, still the father of 3 young children. Leaving them felt like another betrayal, another failure, another piece of evidence that he was the selfish person he'd always believed himself to be. The guilt was crushing. Paul was abandoning his children the way he'd abandoned his brother, his father, his responsibilities. But he also couldn't stay in a marriage that felt like a lie. The impossible choice between his happiness and his duty became another source of self-punishment. Paul's divorce from Jackie and marriage to Joanne in 1958 brought both joy and devastating guilt. Paul's eldest son, Scott, who was 8 years old when his parents divorced, never forgave his father for leaving. Scott idolized Paul, but also resented him deeply. The boy understood that his father had chosen another woman over their family, and that knowledge poisoned their relationship from the beginning. Paul tried to compensate for his guilt by being the perfect father when he was with his children from his first marriage. But the harder he tried, the more artificial it felt. The kids could sense his desperation, his need for their forgiveness, and it made them uncomfortable. Scott, in particular, seemed to understand that his father was using fatherhood as a form of penance. "Dad doesn't love us," Scott told his sister Susan when he was 12. "He just feels guilty about us." That's different. As Paul's career soared in the 1960s and 1970s, his personal life became increasingly complicated by success. Movies like Cool Hand Luke, Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, and The Sting made Paul one of the biggest stars in the world. But success felt like fraud to Paul. He was convinced that people would eventually discover he was just a good-looking guy from Ohio who had fooled everyone into thinking he could act. Paul's response to success was to work even harder, to demand even more of himself. He became obsessed with authenticity. If he was going to fake being an actor, at least he could be perfectly authentic in his preparation. This obsession extended to every aspect of his life. Paul became a fanatic about physical fitness, maintaining his body like a precision instrument. He studied cooking until he could prepare restaurant-quality meals. He learned about wine until he could compete with professional sommeliers. He took up race car driving and approached it with the same perfectionist intensity he brought to acting. But Paul's most destructive obsession was with proving he was a good father to Scott. Scott Newman had grown up to be a handsome, intelligent young man, but he was also deeply troubled. He struggled with drug addiction, had difficulty maintaining relationships, and seemed to be constantly searching for something he could never quite find. Paul blamed himself for Scott's problems. If he had been a better father, if he hadn't left the family, if he had somehow been able to give Scott the stability and security the boy needed, maybe Scott would be okay. Paul's guilt made him unable to set boundaries with Scott. When Scott asked for money, Paul gave it, even knowing it would probably go to drugs. When Scott got into legal trouble, Paul fixed it. When Scott needed help, Paul dropped everything, even if it meant abandoning other responsibilities. "I was trying to buy forgiveness," Paul later said. "I was trying to prove that I loved Scott more than I had loved my own ambitions. But love isn't about guilt, and guilt isn't love. I never learned that distinction until it was too late." The tragedy that would destroy Paul Newman happened on November 20th, 1978. Scott Newman, 28 years old and struggling with a severe cocaine and alcohol addiction, was found dead in his hotel room in Los Angeles. The official cause of death was an accidental overdose, a lethal combination of cocaine, Seconal, and alcohol. Paul received the call while he was at home in Connecticut with Joanne. He listened to the news in silence, hung up the phone, and didn't speak for 3 days. When he finally broke his silence, the only thing he said was, "I killed him. Just like I killed Arthur. I killed my son." Paul's guilt over Scott's death consumed him for the rest of his life. Paul blamed himself for everything, for the divorce that had destabilized Scott's childhood, for the money that had enabled Scott's drug use, for the attention he had given his career instead of his son, for being a father who loved from a distance instead of being present. Paul entered therapy, but he used it as another form of self-punishment rather than healing. He dissected every mistake he had made as a father, every moment when he had chosen work over family, every sign of Scott's troubles that he had missed or ignored. Paul was determined to take responsibility for Scott's death, said his therapist, Dr. Martha Weinman. But taking responsibility had become another form of perfectionism for him. He wanted to be perfectly guilty, perfectly blamed, perfectly punished. He couldn't accept that some things are beyond our control. Paul's response to Scott's death was to try to save other people's children. Paul threw himself into charitable work with an intensity that worried his friends and family. He established the Scott Newman Foundation to educate young people about drug abuse. He donated millions to various causes. He worked with at-risk youth, trying to be the father figure for them that he felt he had failed to be for Scott. But even his charity work was driven by guilt rather than pure altruism. Paul was trying to earn redemption through good works, trying to prove that he was worthy of the forgiveness he could never give himself. Paul's final decades were marked by both incredible professional success and ongoing personal torment. Films like The Verdict and The Color of Money proved that Paul was indeed one of the greatest actors of his generation. His Newman's Own food company became a billion-dollar business that donated all its profits to charity. His racing career brought him satisfaction in a way that acting never had. But Paul's perfectionism had evolved from a drive for excellence into a form of self-torture. Every award felt undeserved. Every compliment felt like a lie. Every success felt like evidence that the world had been fooled by a man who was fundamentally flawed. Paul's marriage to Joanne survived, but it was tested by his guilt and obsessiveness. Joanne later said, "Living with Paul was like loving a man who was constantly punishing himself for crimes he didn't commit. I could love him, but I couldn't save him from himself." In his final interview in 2008, shortly before his death from cancer, Paul was asked about his greatest regret. "I spent my whole life trying to be perfect," he said. "Perfect son, perfect actor, perfect father, perfect husband. But perfection is just another word for death. You can't be human and perfect at the same time. I chose perfectionism, and it cost me my humanity." When asked what he would tell his younger self, Paul's answer was heartbreaking. "I would tell him that being good enough is good enough, that loving people imperfectly is better than not loving them at all. That forgiveness, especially forgiving yourself, isn't something you earn. It's something you choose." Paul Newman died on September 26, 2008, at the age of 83. At his memorial service, Joanne spoke about the man behind the legend. "Paul was the most moral person I ever knew, but he was moral to a fault. He held himself to standards that no human being could meet, and he punished himself when he inevitably fell short. His greatest strength was also his greatest weakness." Today, Paul Newman is remembered as one of Hollywood's greatest stars and most generous philanthropists. But his real legacy might be the lesson. His life teaches about the danger of perfectionism, the importance of self-forgiveness, and the understanding that being human means being flawed. Paul Newman spent 50 years trying to earn forgiveness for being imperfect. He never understood that the perfection he sought was not only impossible, but also undesirable. Perfection is not human. Perfection is not love. Perfection is not life. The tragedy of Paul Newman isn't that he wasn't perfect. The tragedy is that he spent his entire life punishing himself for his humanity. And in doing so, he lost much of what made life worth living. He had a successful career, a loving marriage, talented children, and the respect of millions. But he could never enjoy any of it because he was always focused on where he had fallen short. Paul's story is particularly relevant today. In an age of social media, perfectionism, and impossible standards, we live in a world where everyone's life looks perfect online, where success is measured in achievements and acquisitions, where any sign of vulnerability or failure is seen as weakness. Paul Newman's life shows us where that path leads, to a prison of our own making. Where nothing we accomplish is ever enough. The real Paul Newman legacy isn't his movies or his charity work. It's the reminder that perfection is the enemy of happiness, that self-forgiveness is more important than self-improvement, and that the goal of life shouldn't be to avoid making mistakes, but to learn from them and move forward with compassion for ourselves and others. Paul Newman was a great actor, a devoted husband, a generous philanthropist, and a loving father. He was also a man who made mistakes, who hurt people he loved, who struggled with guilt and perfectionism and self-doubt. These two truths don't cancel each other out. They make him human. Perhaps that's the most important lesson from Paul Newman's life. We don't have to be perfect to be worthy of love, success, or happiness. We just have to be authentic, compassionate, and willing to keep trying to be better. Not perfect, but better. What do you think? Does Paul Newman's struggle with perfectionism and guilt resonate with pressures you felt in your own life? Share your thoughts about the balance between striving for excellence and accepting our human limitations. If this story moved you, subscribe for more untold truths about the Golden Age stars who seemed perfect but were fighting very human battles. Because understanding their struggles helps us understand our own. Paul Newman showed us that even the most successful people can be prisoners of their own expectations, and that sometimes the greatest courage is learning to forgive yourself.